The RX7 wins for the first time.
RX7 が勝ちました。
Le RX7 gagne.
The RX7.
The RX7.
It wasn't long ago when I thought the RX7 had nothing to do with motorsport, but I loved it for two reasons: its looks and its uniqueness. Few people truly understand the RX7's incredible racing pedigree, and that's part of a much bigger problem. Most people recognize it from Fast and Furious or Initial D. They see it as a flashy car with an unreliable rotary engine, more of a toy than a serious machine. Only a handful know the real story behind its motorsport legacy. Because of this, the RX7 is often dismissed as overrated, a car for kids that doesn't live up to the legend surrounding it. But is that really the full story? A cool-looking car with a temperamental engine that became popular with a younger crowd? I never thought the RX7 was overrated until I learned just how dominant it was in racing. Before you call me crazy though, let me just show you what's really hiding beneath those sexy curves. When you peel back the layers of the RX7's reputation, you uncover one of the most impressive motorsport histories of any production car. This isn't a tale of a car that was content to sit back and be admired only for its looks. No, this is the story of a machine that competed in and dominated some of the world's toughest racing series. Imagine a car that not only collected trophies but made its entire championship almost mundane because it was so brilliant race after race. The RX7 racked up 13 championships and well over 100 wins over its lifetime. It triumphed in the Japanese Touring Car Championship, conquered the British Touring Car Championship, and even clinched victory at the grueling 24 Hours of Spa. Perhaps most astonishingly, it recorded 10 wins in a row at the 24 Hours of Daytona, and in the realm of the International Motorsports Association, IMSA, it amassed 100 wins and 10 consecutive championships. But before you click off the video, keep in mind, these championships were not just some casual playgrounds. The RX7 went up against fierce competition in every race. Winning 10 championships in a row might make it seem like the series lacked real contenders, but the truth is, this Dorito-powered machine was simply that dominant. It made the races look effortless. We're talking about Mustangs, Camaros, Porsches, and even Ferraris, the very best the racing world had to offer. In IMSA's highly competitive GTU and GTO classes, for example, Mazda went head-to-head with the raw, powerful Ford Mustang and the iconic Chevrolet Camaro, machines built on a tradition of American muscle. These cars were armed with heavy, torque-laden V8 engines producing upwards of 350 to 400 horsepower, and they weighed in at 3,500 pounds or more. Their design philosophy was simple: raw power, aggressive styling, and the kind of brute force that could steamroll nearly any opposition in a straight line. Yet, while these American stalwarts relied on sheer brute force, the RX7 was a study in finesse. Its lightweight construction, barely tipping the scales at around 2,300 to 3,000 pounds, and its near-perfect weight distribution allowed it to twist and turn through corners with astonishing agility. Unlike the Mustang and Camaro, whose mass meant they needed longer, straighter sections to put their power to good use, the RX7's chassis was designed for precision. Its rotary engine, which delivered peak power at around 7,000 to 8,000 RPM, unleashed bursts of acceleration that were exceptionally linear and immediate. In one memorable race at Daytona, lap times showed that in twisty technical sections, the RX7 could be as much as 1 full second faster per lap than the heavier V8 rivals, a gap that, over a 24-hour endurance race, was nothing short of staggering. The RX7's secret wasn't just about power output, it was about how that power was applied. With a power-to-weight ratio that rivaled even the best sports cars of its time, the RX7's engine delivered an almost telepathic connection between throttle and grip. When exiting corners, the RX7's lightweight nature meant that every ounce of acceleration was efficiently converted into speed, leaving the Mustang and Camaro with their bulky engines and inertia scrambling for traction. Every lap was a lesson in agility. Where raw muscle might pound down a straight, the RX7 danced through bends, its precision handling forcing its heavier competitors to fight for every inch of track. Then there was the European battleground. The Porsche 911 Carrera variants, icons in their own right, were often seen as the epitome of precision engineering. The 911's naturally aspirated flat-six engine produced around 250 to 300 horsepower, but the car's rear engine layout and heavier curb weight, often in the vicinity of 3,100 pounds, presented unique handling challenges. In contrast, the RX7's mid-engine configuration, thanks to its compact rotary design, offered near-perfect weight distribution, enabling it to launch into corners with explosive acceleration. At the famous Spa race, drivers reported that the RX-7's ability to maintain high speeds through the narrow, twisting corners left the 911 struggling to keep pace. There were instances where, on a single hairpin bend, the RX-7 would exit with a burst of speed that was over a second faster than the 911's best effort. But in endurance and sprint races, the RX-7 wasn't just pitted against American muscle and European legends, it also directly raced against exotic Ferraris. In at least one documented IMSA event during the late 1970s, the RX-7 squared off against the Ferrari Dyno 308 GT4, a car powered by a mid-sized V8 and celebrated for its sleek Italian design. Despite the Ferrari's pedigree and allure, the RX-7's lightweight chassis, razor-sharp handling, and high-revving rotary engine allowed it to close the gap and even outlap the Dyno 308 on technical sections of the circuit. In a 1979 road and track feature, the RX-7's agility through twisty, high downforce corners enabled it to maintain lap times that forced the Ferrari to fight for every position. A clear demonstration that on track, precision, and balance could trump exotic power. This wasn't just about bragging rights, it was a testament to Mazda's engineering philosophy that a well-balanced, nimble machine could consistently outperform a heavier, more power-focused rival, even one with the Ferrari name attached. If there's one championship that truly cemented the RX-7's place in racing history, it's IMSA. The International Motorsports Association was no joke. It was one of the most fiercely contested sports car series in the world, featuring brutal endurance races, stacked grids, and some of the best teams and drivers in motorsport. And yet, somehow, Mazda managed to own it. From the late 1970s through the 1980s, the RX-7 was a dominant force in the GTU class, racking up 100 victories and an unprecedented 8 consecutive championships, with another 2 in the GTO category. No other car in IMSA history had put together a streak like this. But how did it manage to dominate for so long? It wasn't because Mazda had the most powerful car on the grid. In fact, when the RX-7 first entered the IMSA competition, it was outgunned by cars with larger, more powerful engines. What set it apart was balance, reliability, it's true, stop laughing, and sheer engineering ingenuity. Mazda's racing division, working with legendary tuner Jim Downing, and later with the Mazda Speed Factory, refined the RX-7 into an endurance racing weapon. The key was the rotary engine, not just for its high revving nature, but for its mechanical simplicity and durability. While rival teams constantly battled reliability issues with their V8s and inline-sixes, the RX-7's 13B rotary was almost bulletproof. It could withstand 24 hours of relentless abuse without skipping a beat. One of the most defining moments of the RX-7's IMSA reign came in the 1979 24 Hours of Daytona. This was Mazda's first serious shot at the legendary American endurance race, and they were up against seasoned manufacturers, Porsche, BMW, and Datsun, all with established racing pedigree. No one expected much from the small, rotary-powered coupe. But then, something incredible happened. As the race unfolded, many of the more powerful cars ran into trouble. Mechanical failures, overheating, driver fatigue. Meanwhile, Mazda's RX-7, driven by Yojiro Terada, Yoshimi Katayama, and Takashi Yorino, kept a relentless, consistent pace. The rotary engine, running at nearly 8,000 RPM for hours on end, just wouldn't quit. With the sunrise came a realization: the RX-7 was leading its class. By the final few hours, it had built an unbelievable gap. And when the checkered flag waved, Mazda had done the impossible. They had won their first ever class victory at Daytona. And by the early 1980s, Mazda had become the team to beat in IMSA's GTU class. But there was one challenge that stood above the rest: Porsche. The Porsche 911 Carrera RSR was IMSA's gold standard. Fast, well-balanced, and backed by decades of German engineering. If Mazda wanted to keep their streak alive, they had to figure out how to beat it. Enter Mazda racing engineer Takashi Yodo. Yodo-san knew that, while the RX-7 had the advantage in agility, it needed better power delivery to counter Porsche's torque-heavy flat sixes. The solution? A revised peripheral port 13B rotary engine pushing power past 300 horsepower, an astronomical number for a 1.3-litre engine at the time. With this setup, the RX-7 won the 1980 IMSA GTU Championship and then the 1981 championship, and 1982, and 1983, and 1984. Porsche, despite constant upgrades, couldn't stop it. 10 titles, 100 wins, a decade of dominance. While the RX-7 was carving out its place in American endurance racing though, it was also taking on another challenge, touring car racing in Europe. In 1980, Mazda entered the British Touring Car Championship BTCC. This was an entirely different battlefield, shorter sprint races, intense wheel-to-wheel combat, and a grid stacked with European powerhouses like Ford Capri, which were European, BMW 3 Series, and Alfa Romeos. Once again, the RX-7 wasn't the favorite, but it had something the competition didn't: giant-killing agility. The RX-7, piloted by racing legend Win Percy, became an instant contender. Percy, a master of car control, used the RX-7's perfect weight distribution to devastating effect, diving into corners later than anyone else, carrying speed through bends where others had to lift off. And by the end of the season, Mazda had won the BTCC championship. By the late 1980s, the RX-7 was nearing the end of its competitive lifespan, but before it faded into history, Mazda wanted one last shot at the biggest race of them all, Le Mans. At the 1983 24 Hours of Le Mans, Mazda entered the RX-7 in the GTP class, facing off against turbocharged Porsches, Jaguars, and Lancias. Despite being massively underpowered compared to the turbocharged opposition, the RX-7 once again showcased its endurance racing prowess. It finished the grueling 24-hour race without a single mechanical failure, a feat that even some of the factory-backed giants couldn't match. But the RX-7 wasn't just one car, it had 3 generations of continuous improvement, each with its own identity and role in shaping Mazda's racing legacy. Yet, when people talk about the RX-7 today, they mostly focus on one, the FD. The one that made it into pop culture, the one that gets called overrated. And while the FD is certainly an icon, it's not the full story. So let's break it down. The first generation RX-7, the FD, introduced in 1978, was Mazda's answer to the growing demand for lightweight sports cars. With its 1.1-litre and later 1.3-litre Rotary engine, it wasn't the most powerful car on the road, but what it lacked in raw horsepower, it made up for in balance and agility. The first gen was the car that put the RX-7 on the racing map. It was the one that dominated IMSA's GTU class, proving that a tiny rotary-powered coupe could run circles around bigger, more powerful V8s and flat 6s. Then came the second generation RX-7, the FC, in 1985. Heavily inspired by the Porsche 944, the FC was a more refined, more powerful evolution of the original. It introduced turbocharging, which boosted power beyond 200 horsepower, and a more advanced suspension system that made it an even sharper track weapon. The FC carried the RX-7's racing success forward, winning championships in IMSA, BTCC, and even the 24 Hours of Spa. It built on the first gen's legacy, showing that Mazda wasn't just lucky, they were serious about racing. And then there's the third generation RX-7, the famous FD, the one everyone knows. Launched in 1992, the FD was a revolution. A twin turbocharged 13B engine, near perfect 50-50 weight distribution, and one of the best chassis designs of the era made it an instant legend. It was a precision tool, built for high-speed cornering and relentless acceleration. The FD had its share of racing success, particularly in Japan's JGTC and Super Taikyu series, but by this point Mazda had largely stepped back from international endurance racing. And yet, the RX-7 had done everything a race car could possibly do. It had won in America, it had won in Europe, it had beaten muscle cars, Porsches, and Ferraris. It had dominated endurance racing for a full decade, but to this day, people still dismiss it as just a cool-looking car with an unreliable engine. For all its racing pedigree, for all the championships and victories, the RX-7 still carries a certain reputation outside the world of motorsport. Ask around, and you'll find plenty of people who see it as an overrated, overhyped machine. A car with more style than substance. But why? What exactly is it that makes people dismiss the RX-7? There are 5 main arguments. 1. It's unreliable. This is the first and most common argument against the RX-7, and to be fair, it's not without merit. The rotary engine, while an engineering marvel, has a well-earned reputation for being temperamental. Compared to piston engines, it's more sensitive to maintenance, miss an oil change, run it too lean, or neglect the cooling system, and it's game over. The apex seals, the rotary equivalent of piston rings, are notorious for failing, and when they do, rebuilding a rotary isn't as simple or cheap as replacing a set of pistons. And then there's the FD. The third generation Rx7 is the one that really cemented the car's reputation for being unreliable, largely because of its complex sequential twin turbo system. Mazda's engineers pushed the limits of what was possible, but in doing so, they created a system that required constant care. Many owners, especially in the used market, weren't prepared for the level of maintenance it needed, leading to blown engines, overheating issues, and endless electrical gremlins. To those who have experienced these problems firsthand, the RX-7 isn't some untouchable racing icon, it's just a frustratingly fragile money pit. 2. It's slow. This one might sound ridiculous, but think about it from the perspective of someone outside the RX-7 fanbase. In stock form, the first two generations were never power monsters. Even the turbocharged FC wasn't exactly blowing the doors off the competition. The FD was fast, but by today's standards, a stock FD RX-7 makes around 276 horsepower, roughly the same as a modern Honda Civic Type R. It's not slow, but it's not some unbeatable speed demon either. And then there's the torque, or lack of it. The rotary engine is unique in that it makes power at high RPMs, but low-end torque is almost non-existent. This means that in everyday driving, especially at lower speeds, the RX-7 can feel sluggish compared to a similarly powered piston engine car. A turbocharged Supra, a Mustang, or even a BMW M3 from the same era will often feel more responsive in real-world conditions. For a car with so much hype surrounding it, some people take a drive in an RX-7 and walk away thinking, that's it? 3. It's overhyped because of pop culture. Let's be real, if it weren't for Fast and Furious and Initial D, would the RX-7 have the same level of mainstream recognition today? The FD, in particular, became one of the most beloved cars in gaming, movies, and anime, to the point where its legend grew beyond reality. To the outside world, it's the ultimate JDM dream car, a machine with god-tier handling and speed. But when people finally get behind the wheel, they realize it's still just a 30-year-old sports car. It's not the fastest, it's not the most reliable, it's not even the rarest, and yet prices have skyrocketed, with clean examples going for absurd amounts of money. To some, the RX-7 has become more of a status symbol than a performance car, something people buy because of its image rather than its driving experience. And when a car's reputation outgrows its actual performance, it's only natural for some people to call it overrated. 4. Other cars did it better. This is the argument from people who compare the RX-7 to its rivals. They'll point out that Nissan had the Skyline GT-R, which packed more power and cutting-edge all-wheel drive technology. Toyota had the Supra, a turbocharged monster with bulletproof reliability and endless tuning potential. Even Honda, with the NSX, created a mid-engine sports car that could run circles around the RX-7 in terms of refinement and daily usability. And yet, RX-7 fans insist that it's the ultimate driver's car, that it's better than the Supra, better than the Skyline, better than almost anything from its era. To the skeptics, this just sounds like fanboyism. 5. The FD didn't define Mazda's racing success. For all the love the FD gets, it's not the car that built Mazda's racing legacy. That credit belongs to the first two generations. The FB was the one that put Mazda on the map, proving that a small, lightweight rotary coupe could take on and beat bigger, more powerful machines in IMSA's GTU class. The FC took that foundation and pushed it even further, winning championships across IMSA, BTCC, and endurance racing in Europe. These were the RX-7s that made history. But the FD? By the time it arrived, Mazda had already stepped back from international endurance racing. It had its moments in Japan's JGTC and Super Taikyu series, but it never dominated in the way its predecessors did. And yet, when people talk about the RX-7 today, it's always the FD that gets the spotlight. It's the one that shows up in movies, games, and social media posts. The irony is that the RX-7 does have an incredible racing pedigree, just not in the way most people think. The legend was built by the FB and FC, while the FD, the one that's praised the most, made the least impact. So, is the RX-7 overrated? In a way, yes. The mainstream love for it, thanks to movies and anime, blurs its true legacy, making it feel more like a pop culture icon than a serious contender in motorsport. It's become a symbol of style over substance, and that kind of hype can easily make any car seem overrated. But here's the twist. The RX7 is also one of the most underrated cars ever made. Behind all the flashing lights and fandom, it hides one of the most dominant motorsport histories of any car in its class. People know the RX7 for its looks, for its fleeting fame in Fast and Furious or Initial D, but few understand the raw racing pedigree it's built on. When I realized how incredible the RX7's racing history was, it hit me. It's not just that it's underrated in the world of motorsport, it's also overrated by the world at large. People love it because of the story they've created around it, but they never dig deeper to uncover what really made this car legendary. And that, in its own strange way, feels kind of perfect. Its true essence is buried under layers of hype. The RX7 is a paradox, and that's what makes it so damn fascinating.